Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
He paid 500,000 pesos for his sister's wedding, and then his mother sent a text, "You don't need to come to the celebration. Your stepfather thinks you ruined the family photos." By morning, they received an eviction notice from his apartment. The warm September breeze rustled the curtain in the living room, filling the room with the scent of fading leaves. Eduardo, sitting in his rented office, tapped his fingers on the desk while the computer processed another client request. A 35-year-old programmer with a bulky frame and a ginger beard he'd been growing for the past 5 years, he looked nothing like the stereotypical tech worker, more like a lumberjack or a biker. But behind the unconventional appearance was one of the city's top cybersecurity experts. His phone buzzed. Mom lit up on the screen. "Eddie, do you remember that Isabella's engagement is this Saturday?" His mother's voice sounded casual, like she was talking about a trip to the store. "Of course I remember." Eduardo leaned back in his chair, looking at a framed photo on his desk, a snapshot of the 3-bedroom apartment in the city center where he'd spent his childhood. The apartment that, technically, belonged to him. "Rafael thinks we should book El Palacio," his mother continued. "But you understand." Eduardo smirked. Rafael thinks, that phrase had haunted him for the past 15 years, ever since the stepfather came into their lives. Rafael Morales, a minor clerk in the city municipality, with his perpetually perfectly ironed shirts and the folder he always carried under his arm like a badge of authority, entered their life when Eduardo was 20. "I'll take care of the restaurant," Eduardo replied. "And everything else, too. She's my sister, after all." He hung up and sighed, glancing at the clock. He had a client meeting in half an hour, but his thoughts drifted back to the apartment story. The inheritance story began nearly 10 years ago. After his parents divorced, his father, a senior engineer at a construction company, decided to transfer ownership of the 3-bedroom apartment to his son. "It's your insurance, son," his father had said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Your mother can marry whoever she wants, but no one will ever kick you out of this home." 2 years later, his father died of a heart attack. Eduardo was 23. He had just graduated from university and started working as a programmer. That was when Rafael appeared. Short, lean, with a tidy haircut and manners clearly aimed at projecting refinement. From the very beginning, the stepfather had made it clear Eduardo didn't fit into his vision of a proper family. "You should lose some weight, Eduardo," his stepfather would say, casting a critical glance at him. "And those jeans of yours. Is that really how a college-educated man should look?" Back then, Eduardo would simply shrug. He was quickly promoted at work and soon earned enough to rent his own apartment. Moving out seemed like the best decision, especially since his mother tearfully asked him to let them stay in the apartment. "Edito, where would Rafael and I go? He only has his salary, and I'm on a pension. Isabella is still in school." His mother never held back emotionally when it came to money or property. Eduardo agreed. Let them live there, it was family, after all. He moved out, letting them stay in his apartment rent-free. No contracts, just a verbal agreement. 5 years flew by. Eduardo built a successful career, earned a solid reputation, and gained valuable connections in the IT field. His mother had a card linked to his bank account, which she could use for unexpected expenses. Major renovations, new furniture, Isabella's education, all of it landed on Eduardo's shoulders. "You can't imagine how proud Rafael is of the new interior," his mother would tell him over the phone. Now he's not ashamed to invite his colleagues over. At family dinners, which happened about once a month, Eduardo mostly stayed silent, watching his stepfather go on about his so-called work achievements and how hard it was to deal with ordinary people when you were an intellectual with a special mindset. "Take our Eduardo, for example," Rafael would say, pointing his fork at his stepson. "A programmer, not exactly a janitor, and yet he looks like." He would pause, searching for the right comparison, like a lumberjack on the loose. His mother would chuckle nervously, his sister would stare into her plate, and Eduardo would chew silently, knowing arguing was pointless. Over the years, the relationship with his stepfather never improved. Lacking any real accomplishments of his own, Raphael compensated with constant criticism of those around him, especially Eduardo. Everything irritated him: Eduardo's speech patterns, his growing ginger beard, which he had started growing after turning 30. "It's downright indecent," Raphael fumed over dinner. "You look like some homeless guy at a bus station. At least trim that mop." Eduardo stayed silent, smiling faintly. His appearance, so far from polished standards, had become a kind of shield, a natural filter that kept superficial people away. The day Isabella, his younger sister, announced her upcoming wedding, Eduardo didn't hesitate for a second. "I'll pay for everything," he said, watching her face light up with relief. "Pick any restaurant, dress, photographer, whatever you want. Edito, you're our savior." His mother burst into tears at the table, moved by her son's generosity. Raphael gave a forced smile but said nothing. Only later, as Eduardo was about to leave, did his stepfather corner him in the hallway. "Don't think that just because you're paying, you get to run the show," he said quietly, adjusting his tie knot. "A wedding is a family event. Everything should look respectable." Eduardo just chuckled, letting the comments slide. He was used to these jabs. As Saturday and the engagement approached, Eduardo felt an unexpected joy. For the first time in a long while, he felt genuinely helpful to his sister, the only family member who had never criticized his looks or lifestyle. Maybe things will finally get better after the wedding, he thought, closing his laptop and getting ready for a meeting. The universe, however, had other plans. A week before the wedding, Eduardo's life was a flurry of organized chaos. Daily meetings with the wedding planner, endless wire transfers to vendors, and countless detail confirmations ate up most of his free time. Despite his ongoing cybersecurity projects, he dove headfirst into the wedding rush. Eduardo was sitting in a cafe across from his office when Valeria, the elegant wedding planner with a laptop and a permanent tablet in hand, sat down across from him with her usual businesslike air. "Everything's ready on the flower front," she said, scrolling through her list. "The arrangements will be delivered to the restaurant by 10 a.m. The banquet hall is reserved, the menu confirmed. All we need is to finalize the guest count." "How many do we have on the preliminary list?" Eduardo asked, sipping his Americano. 93 people, including the bride and groom," Valeria replied. "But Isabella mentioned there might be some changes. I need the final number by the end of the week." "All right, I'll check," Eduardo nodded, pulling out his phone. For the second day in a row, he'd been trying to reach his sister, but Isabella wasn't answering. Her unusual silence was starting to worry him. She usually replied almost instantly, but lately their conversations had become brief and formal. "Did they pick up the wedding dress?" he asked, sending Isabella a message. "Yes, just yesterday. Your sister looks stunning in it," Valeria smiled. "Have you decided what you'll wear?" Eduardo turned his coffee mug in his hands, thinking about a dark blue suit. "Formal, but not too stiff. Tie or bow tie, I haven't decided yet." "Definitely a bow tie," Valeria said enthusiastically. "With your beard, it'll be stylish and a little bohemian." Eduardo smiled. Hearing positive comments about his appearance was unfamiliar. In his family, the beard had always been a constant source of mockery, especially from Raphael. "I know a stylist," Valeria continued. "He could help put together a look." At that moment, Eduardo's phone buzzed. A message from Isabella: "I'll give the guest list to Mom. She'll send it." The wording felt strange. Why was his sister suddenly acting through intermediaries? He called her, but again, there was no answer. "Is something wrong?" Valeria asked, noticing Eduardo's frown. "I don't know," he replied, setting the phone down. "I hope not. Let's finish the planning. I'll get the list, promise." The rest of the day passed in a blur of work. Eduardo tried to focus on a cybersecurity project for a banking system, but his thoughts kept circling back to his sister's strange behavior. At 6 p.m., as the office began to empty out, he decided to call his mother. "Hi, Mom," he said when she finally picked up after the fifth ring. Edito. Her voice sounded unusually tense. How's work? Fine. Do you know what's going on with Isabella? She's not answering my calls. There was a short pause on the other end. She's just very busy, sweetheart. Fittings, meetings with her fiancé, you know, pre-wedding chaos. Sure, but she needs to confirm the guest list. Can you let her know? Eduardo, his mother interrupted, and something in her voice made him tense. We need to talk. Could you come by tonight? Did something happen? We'll talk at home. Can you be here by 8? The uneasy feeling that had been quietly brewing in his chest began to grow. All right, I'll be there. At 8 p.m., Eduardo stood at the door of his former apartment, keys clenched in his hand. Technically, he could let himself in, it was his apartment. But over the years, he'd gotten used to ringing the bell, out of respect for the people living there, even if they were technically living on his property. His mother opened the door. Her hair, usually impeccably styled, was tousled, and her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. Come in, she said, stepping aside. In the living room, Eduardo was met with an unusual sight. Raphael sat in an armchair, looking unusually serious, while Isabella was on the couch, fiddling with the edge of her blouse. The atmosphere was like a family council meeting called to deliver bad news. What's going on? Eduardo asked, stopping in the middle of the room. Raphael cleared his throat and straightened up, assuming his favorite posture of head of the household. Eduardo, we need to discuss some of the wedding arrangements. I'm all ears. His mother glanced quickly at Raphael, then at Isabella, and finally spoke. Edito, sweetheart, we think it might be better if you didn't come to the ceremony, Raphael finished for her, looking Eduardo directly in the eye. A heavy silence filled the room. Eduardo felt an icy chill spreading inside him. What? Try to understand, Raphael continued, rubbing his hands together. We'll have important guests, colleagues from the municipality, city officials, business partners. Everything has to look respectable. And I suppose I'm not respectable enough, Eduardo said slowly, beginning to grasp where the conversation was headed. It's not that, his mother interjected. It's just, you know, your look. The beard, your build. In the photos, it will come across as what? Eduardo's voice remained calm, though tension was building inside. As a real person, not a magazine cutout? As inappropriate, Raphael cut in. Let's be honest. Your appearance doesn't fit the tone of the event. It's an upscale affair, everything needs to be elegant and glamorous, Eduardo finished through clenched teeth. Got it. He turned to Isabella. And you agree with this? His sister flinched, eyes still downcast. I just want everything to go perfectly, Eddie. Perfect pictures, perfect memories. Without me, Eduardo clarified. Don't be dramatic, Raphael said. No one's saying you can't be involved at all. You've already made a huge contribution by funding the whole thing. That means a lot to us. Eduardo gave a bitter smile. So, my money is welcome, but my presence isn't? Edito, don't start, his mother sighed. We just want everything to be flawless. Maybe you could at least trim the beard? It's not just the beard, Raphael interrupted. It's the whole look, it's outdated. Guests will notice, ask questions. We don't need that. Something broke inside Eduardo. For 15 years, he had tolerated the comments and jabs, endured mockery and criticism. For 15 years, he had supported a family that saw him only as a wallet and a walking inconvenience. And now they were asking him not to attend his own sister's wedding, the wedding he had paid for out of pocket. I understand, he said quietly, standing up. Send me the final guest list. The planner needs exact numbers. So you're not upset? His mother asked hopefully. Eduardo looked at her for a long moment. Don't worry about my feelings. They never really mattered to you anyway. He walked toward the door. Isabella finally rose from the couch. Eddie, wait. What? He stopped, without turning around. You know we didn't mean to hurt you. It's just for the sake of perfect photos. Eduardo turned, meeting her gaze. I understand, Isabella. I understand perfectly. The next morning, Eduardo woke with the clear, cold focus of someone who had made an important decision. No trace of the previous night's hurt showed in his movements as he dialed the number of Diego, a university friend and real estate lawyer. Diego, I need some legal advice, Eduardo said when he heard the familiar voice. How quickly can I evict people living in my apartment without a rental contract? Evicting relatives? Diego's tone held no judgment, only professional curiosity. Yes. It's a free use agreement. Verbal only. Then it's simple. You send an official notice terminating the agreement, give them a reasonable time frame to vacate, usually a month, and that's it. If they refuse, you go through the courts. But with clear ownership documentation, it's a solid case. Eduardo nodded, even though Diego couldn't see him. Prepare the documents. I want the notice sent the day after tomorrow. Got it. And Eddie, did something serious happen? Eduardo looked at his reflection in the window. A large man with a red beard that had become a symbol of his independence from other people's opinions. It's just time to set the record straight. After speaking with the lawyer, Eduardo contacted the wedding planner and confirmed he would settle all remaining bills that day. Then he called the restaurant to make sure every detail was still on track. Will you be attending the event? The administrator asked. We need to know who the main point of contact will be. No, I won't be attending, Eduardo replied. Please reach out to the bride or her mother. Throughout the day, Isabella's calls came nonstop. Eduardo ignored them, immersing himself in work. Only in the evening did he read her message. Eddie, I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm so sorry. Rafael just worries about impressions. You know his career depends on those people. We can talk this through. Eduardo replied with a single line. There's nothing to discuss. Don't worry, the wedding will go ahead as planned. That evening, sitting in his rented apartment with a glass of whiskey, Eduardo flipped through old family photos. From a time when they had truly been a family, his father, his mother, little Isabella, and himself, a teenager then, still beardless but already tall and broad. In every photo, his father had an arm proudly around his shoulder. What would you say now, Dad? Eduardo wondered, staring at his father's smiling face. The next day, he went to Diego's office to sign the documents. The official eviction notice was written in cold, emotionless legal language. Just facts and deadlines. I recommend sending it by registered mail with a delivery confirmation, Diego said, handing him the folder. And follow up with an electronic copy, just to avoid any "we never got it" nonsense. Thanks, Eduardo nodded. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Eduardo paused for a moment. You know, all my life I tried to be a good son. Supported my mom after the divorce, took care of the family, endured Rafael's constant jabs. I gave them the apartment, paid for renovations, paid for my sister's education. And their idea of gratitude is to tell me, you're not polished enough for our celebration. Please give us the money and disappear. I get it, Diego said with a nod. That's rough. Exactly. So yes, I'm sure I want to do this. In fact, I plan to sell the apartment. Diego's eyes widened. Seriously? Do they know that? They will, Eduardo shrugged. When they have to start looking for a new place. Eduardo sent the registered eviction notice to the apartment's address. A copy of the notice he forwarded to his mother via messenger with a short message. You have exactly 1 month to vacate the apartment. An hour later, the calls began. First his mother, her voice breaking into a scream as soon as Eduardo confirmed he was serious. Then Rafael, threatening, promising to use his municipal connections. Finally, Isabella, confused, overwhelmed, unable to understand how things had spiraled out of control. "Eddie, you can't do this to us," she sobbed. "Where will we go?" "Where everyone goes when they need a place to live," Eduardo answered calmly. "Rent an apartment. Rafael has a steady job, doesn't he? But his salary isn't enough for a place in the city center." "Then not in the center." "Eddie, this is cruel." "Cruel, Isabella," Eduardo said, feeling the tension of the past few days settle into a heavy fatigue, "is telling someone they're not good-looking enough to attend a celebration they paid for. What I'm doing, it's just business. Nothing personal." The last line dripped with bitter irony, because everything about the situation was deeply personal. That was the problem. On the day of the wedding, Eduardo didn't go to work. He stayed home, turned off his phone, and spent the day reading a book he'd been putting off for months. In the evening, he switched his phone back on and found dozens of messages and missed calls. Among the photos circulating on social media were snapshots from the wedding, Isabella glowing in her white dress, Rafael standing proudly beside her, their mother looking emotional. A perfect picture, paid for by someone who wasn't welcome in it. Eduardo turned off his phone again and poured himself another whiskey. A strange feeling, part liberation, part sorrow, settled over him. He knew he had turned a page in his life, and the next chapter would be written on his terms. 3 days after his sister's wedding, Eduardo woke up feeling lighter than he had in years. The morning sun streaming through the blinds seemed brighter than usual. He stretched, walked to the window, and threw it open, letting the cool autumn air fill the room. Strange, he thought, looking at the waking city. But I feel free. His phone, which he'd finally turned back on the day before, buzzed insistently on the nightstand. Eduardo glanced at the screen. It was his mother, calling for the 12th time in the past 24 hours. He declined the call and headed to the kitchen to make coffee. The morning ritual, grinding beans, brewing in a sieve, slowly enjoying the aroma, always calmed him. Today he allowed himself a small luxury, an omelet with cheese and herbs. He rarely had time for such things, but today was different. Today was the day he decided to say goodbye to the past for good. The phone kept ringing. Again and again. Finally, when his patience ran out, Eduardo answered. "Yes, Mom." At last. Her voice was both accusatory and pleading. "Do you even understand what you're doing? We got your letter. Is this some kind of sick joke?" "It's not a joke," Eduardo said calmly, stirring his coffee. "I'm really planning to sell the apartment. You have 1 month to find a new place." "But where will we live?" Her voice broke into a wail. "You're throwing us out on the street, your own mother." "Rafael works in the municipality," Eduardo reminded her. "Rent something with his salary." "You must be kidding. We can't afford anything decent." "Then you'll have to settle for something less decent," Eduardo replied, taking a sip of coffee. "Or move further from the center." "Edito," her voice cracked with tears. "You can't do this to us. We're your family. You were always such a caring boy." "Apparently something changed," Eduardo said curtly. "Maybe it was the moment you decided I wasn't good enough to attend my own sister's wedding. That was just foolishness. We overreacted. Rafael will apologize. I promise." "It's too late, Mom. The decision's made. You have exactly 30 days from the date you received the notice." He hung up, ignoring the flood of calls that followed. Half an hour later, the phone rang again, this time from an unknown number. Sensing trouble, Eduardo answered anyway. "Hello? Eduardo?" A formal male voice, deliberately polite. "My name is Ignacio Cruz. I'm an attorney representing Mr. Rafael Morales and your mother, Dolores." Eduardo smirked. Rafael didn't waste time. "I'm listening." "My clients have received your eviction notice, which they believe is legally unfounded," the lawyer continued. "According to housing law, family members residing with the property owner may have certain rights in this situation. But I don't live with them, Eduardo interrupted. I moved out 5 years ago. They've been living in my apartment under a verbal agreement for free use. Such an arrangement can be terminated by the owner at any time. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Nevertheless, considering the length of their stay and the family relationship. Contact my lawyer, Eduardo said, giving Diego's name and number. He'll explain the legal position in more detail. Have a good day. Ending the call, Eduardo immediately rang Diego. They've already hired a lawyer, he said when his friend answered. Someone named Cruz. I know him, Diego replied. Second rate. Takes on anything just to make a buck. Don't worry, I'll handle it. For the rest of the day, Eduardo immersed himself in work. Writing code required full focus, leaving no room for thoughts about the family drama. By evening, just as he wrapped up a project, a message from Diego arrived. Spoke to their lawyer. He realized the case is hopeless. They'll likely try to settle this personally. Just as Diego had predicted, the next morning Rafael showed up at Eduardo's door. He looked unusually disheveled, his tie was crooked, and his eyes were red, as if he hadn't slept. We need to talk, he said without greeting. Eduardo stepped aside silently, letting his stepfather in. Rafael looked around, taking in the minimalist interior, the modern appliances, the spacious rooms. Not bad, he commented as he walked into the living room. What do I owe the visit? Eduardo asked coldly, making no gesture to offer a seat. Rafael sat down on the edge of the couch anyway, nervously tapping his fingers against his knee. Listen, Eduardo, he began, trying to sound calm. I understand we may not have been very tactful. The whole wedding thing, it was a misunderstanding. We were all nervous, said things we didn't mean. And what did you really mean? Eduardo stood with his arms crossed, towering over his seated stepfather. That of course you were supposed to be there, Rafael said quickly. But you understand, with our position, your appearance. Our position is what? Eduardo cut in. Freeloaders I generously allow to live in my apartment? Rafael's face flushed with red blotches. There's no need for insults. I came here to talk like adults. I propose we forget this unpleasantness and return to the previous arrangement. And I propose you find a new place to live, Eduardo replied. You have 27 days left. Rafael inhaled sharply, clearly trying to control his anger. Fine. If you insist on changing the terms, we can discuss paying rent. Something symbolic, given our family ties. I'm not renting out the apartment, Eduardo said flatly. I'm selling it. Why? The week after sending the eviction notice became a true test of Eduardo's resilience. The phone never stopped ringing. Messages, calls, voice notes, his mother sobbing, Rafael throwing accusations, became his daily background noise. Eventually, Eduardo muted his phone, filtered all notifications into a separate folder, and checked them only once a day after work. Emotional pressure had no place in his professional life. A major client was waiting on a security system update. On Monday morning, Eduardo was sitting at a cafe across from his office, reviewing code before submission, when a woman in a tailored suit with a folder of documents approached his table. Eduardo, she asked with a professional smile. Elena Aguilar. I'm a realtor. You submitted a request for an apartment valuation? Yes, that's right. He closed his laptop. Please, have a seat. Elena opened the folder and spread several sheets with estimates in front of him. I did a preliminary appraisal based on the photos and data you provided. 3-bedroom, old building, central location, nicely renovated, close to the subway. She ran her finger down the numbers. With a quick sale, we could get a solid price. If you're willing to wait for the ideal buyer, maybe up to 6 months, you could get even more. Eduardo nodded, reviewing the documents. I'm fine with a quick sale. When can viewings begin? As soon as the apartment is vacated, Elena replied. You mentioned relatives are currently living there? They have 3 weeks left. After that, we can begin. Elena nodded with understanding, not asking further questions. A realtor's professional ethics didn't include digging into clients' personal affairs. Excellent. I already have a few potential buyers interested in that area. Once the place is available for showings, we'll get started. After the meeting with the realtor, Eduardo felt a growing sense of certainty in his decision. Selling the apartment wasn't a reactionary move driven by emotion, it was a rational step. Why hold on to a property tied to painful memories? It made more sense to invest in a home that reflected his current life and needs. By evening, while checking the filtered notifications, Eduardo noticed a voice message from his mother recorded an hour earlier. Unlike the previous hysterical ones, this voice was calm, even businesslike. Edito, we need to talk seriously. I understand you're upset, and maybe you have your reasons, but let's discuss things like adults. I'll come see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Please be home. Eduardo sighed. Sooner or later, this conversation had to happen. Better to get it over with than to delay the inevitable. All right, he replied shortly. The next evening, exactly at 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. His mother was at the door, alone, without Raphael. That was already unusual. She looked like she'd aged several years, a sunken face, dim eyes, restless hands. Come in, Eduardo said, stepping aside to let her in. She walked into the living room, glancing around with curiosity. She had never been to his current apartment before. Their meetings always took place on her turf. It's very modern here, she noted, sitting on the edge of the couch. And spacious. Thanks. Eduardo remained standing, not wanting to create the illusion of a cozy family chat. What did you want to talk about? His mother sighed, gathering her thoughts. Edito, I understand you're upset about what happened with the wedding. Yes, we acted badly, I won't argue. Raphael went too far with his obsession about appearances and status. It's not just about the wedding, Mom, Eduardo interrupted. That was just the final straw. What do you mean? 15 years of humiliation, he said calmly. Raphael constantly pointing out how I wasn't good enough. You laughing along with him at my appearance, my lifestyle. You both accepted my help like it was owed, while always looking down on me. She nervously fidgeted with her purse strap. You're exaggerating. Yes, Raphael can be a little blunt, but he never meant to hurt you. Really? Eduardo gave a dry smile. Lumberjack on the loose, bus station hobo, family disgrace, that all sounded very friendly, didn't it? Of course, just jokes. His mother was visibly nervous now. You take everything too seriously. Maybe, Eduardo agreed. But you know what I took very seriously? That a man living for free in my apartment had the nerve to forbid me from attending a family event that I paid for. A heavy silence fell. His mother looked down. Fine, I understand you're hurt. We were wrong. But are you really going to kick us out over one mistake? Where are we supposed to go, Edito? That's no longer my problem, Eduardo replied firmly. Raphael has a job at the municipality, remember? You've both had years to save for your own place or at least a mortgage down payment. Instead, you lived off me. Lived off you, her voice rose with indignation. I gave my whole life to you. Who stayed up with you when you were sick? Who denied herself everything so you could get an education? Thank you for that, Eduardo replied calmly. But you know what normal parents do? They raise their children out of love and care, not to demand lifelong repayment. They don't keep a tally of sacrifices. You're saying I didn't love you? Her eyes filled with tears. After everything I did for you? No, Mom. I'm saying real love doesn't come with conditions. It doesn't keep score or hold favors over someone's head. His mother looked at him in disbelief. She truly couldn't comprehend his position. In her worldview, children were indebted to their parents by birth, and no repayment could ever be enough. Still, she finally said, wiping away tears, But where will we go? We can't afford a decent place. And Raphael might not get his promotion now, after this scandal. What scandal? Eduardo asked, confused. Our move. People will ask why we suddenly left such a nice apartment in the center. There will be gossip. Eduardo shook his head. Even now, his mother was more concerned about her husband's reputation than the rupture with her son. That's not my problem, he repeated. You still have 3 weeks to find a place. And if we don't find anything suitable in that time? Her voice trembled again. Then you'll have to settle for something unsuitable, Eduardo said coldly. Or ask Raphael's relatives for help. He has a mother, doesn't he? She's an old woman in a 2-room flat out in the provinces, she gasped. Raphael would have to commute 2 hours. Then he'll have to start waking up earlier, Eduardo shrugged. His mother stood up, clutching her purse with whitened knuckles. I don't recognize you, Edito. You've become so cruel. It's those computers of yours. They've made you into a heartless machine. Eduardo only smirked. A classic tactic, attack the person when you have no real argument. I think we're done here, he said, walking to the door. His mother followed but paused just before stepping out. Edito, she said quietly. I know you're angry, but think carefully. We're the only family you have. With your looks and your temperament, you'll end up all alone. That last attempt at manipulation only made Eduardo smile sadly. You know, Mom, I'd rather be alone than with people who see me as a burden or a source of shame. Goodbye. When the door closed behind his mother, Eduardo didn't feel bitterness or regret, only a strange sense of relief, like he'd finally set down a heavy weight he'd been carrying for years. The next 2 weeks passed relatively quietly. The family seemed to have accepted the inevitable. The calls and messages became less frequent, and their tone shifted from aggressive to pleading. Raphael no longer threatened with municipal connections, and his mother stopped bringing up her sacrifices. One evening, leaving the gym he had recently joined, Eduardo unexpectedly ran into Isabella. She was standing near the entrance, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Hi, she said with a strained smile. I've been calling, but you didn't pick up. My phone's in the locker, Eduardo explained. Were you waiting for me? Isabella nodded. Can we sit somewhere? Talk? They went to a small cafe down the street. Isabella looked worn out, dark circles under her eyes, pale face, cracked lips. How was the honeymoon? Eduardo asked once they settled at a table. It was fine, she shrugged. We spent a week on the coast. Congratulations on the marriage. He truly did want things to work out for his sister, despite everything. Thanks. Isabella fidgeted with the salt shaker, unsure how to bring up the real reason she was there. Eddie. I heard you're planning to sell the apartment. I am, he replied. But why? Even if you want Mom and Raphael to move out, you could just rent it out. It's Dad's legacy. Eduardo looked at her intently. That's exactly why, Isabella. Dad left me that apartment so I'd feel safe, so I'd have a place where I was respected. And what ended up happening? Isabella lowered her eyes. We treated you terribly, I know. But Mom and Raphael just panicked over the wedding. There were important people there, people Raphael's career depends on. And my presence might have ruined everything, Eduardo finished for her. Because I wasn't presentable enough. Right? That's not what I meant, Isabella protested. But that's what you all thought, Eduardo said calmly. And you know what's saddest? No one even tried to find a compromise. You didn't ask me to trim my beard or wear something more formal. You just decided I was so terrible to look at that I had to disappear. Isabella remained silent, nervously tearing at a napkin. I wanted to invite you, she finally whispered. But Raphael insisted. And you sided with him. He's my stepfather. He raised me since I was 12. And I'm your brother, Eduardo said simply. And I paid for that damn wedding. Isabella buried her face in her hands. I know. I'm a terrible sister. I ruined everything. Eduardo sighed. He didn't want to hurt her. After all, Isabella really had been caught in the middle. It's not about you, Isabella. It was just the last straw after years of humiliation. I simply decided I'd had enough. But selling the apartment. She looked up at him with teary eyes. Where will they go? That's their problem, Eduardo said firmly. They're adults. They'll have to learn to live within their means. And if they can't find anything decent? Rent in the center is insane. And on the outskirts, it's dangerous. Eduardo shook his head. You're exaggerating. First, no one has to live in the center. Second, Rafael has a mother with a 2-bedroom flat in the provinces. But it's so far from his work. Then he'll have to wake up earlier, Eduardo shrugged. Millions of people commute from the suburbs every day. It's not the end of the world. Isabella looked completely lost. I don't know what to do. Mom's hysterical. Rafael is furious with everyone. It's impossible to be at home. Then don't be, Eduardo suggested. You have a husband and your own apartment. Live your own life. But they're still my family. They're mine too, Eduardo said softly. But sometimes you have to set boundaries. Especially with family. They talked for nearly an hour. Isabella tried to find a compromise. Maybe Eduardo could give them more time, or help with a down payment on a mortgage, or cover a few months' rent. I'm done helping them, Eduardo said firmly. I carried them for 15 years. Now it's their turn to stand on their own. As they said goodbye outside the cafe, Isabella suddenly hugged him, tight for someone so petite. I love you anyway, you bearded idiot, she whispered. I love you too, Eduardo replied, heart aching. Be happy, kid. 3 days before the eviction deadline, Eduardo received a message from his mother. We found an apartment. We're moving out tomorrow. We'll leave the keys with the neighbor. He didn't reply, but he felt something strange, a mix of relief and quiet sadness. Something was irreversibly changing in his life. The next day, Diego confirmed there were no legal obstacles to the sale. The documents were clean, no encumbrances. I'll contact the realtor, Eduardo said, and schedule viewings for next week. You sure you want to sell? Diego asked. It's a solid investment. You could rent it out and make passive income. Eduardo shook his head. I don't want anything to do with that apartment. Too many memories. A week later, Eduardo entered the apartment for the first time in years. A strange feeling, to be the official owner of a place he hadn't lived in for so long. The family had truly moved out, taking all the furniture and personal items. The empty rooms felt bigger, but still bore traces of their presence, scuff marks on the floor where furniture used to be, outlines of old picture frames on the walls, the lingering scent of someone else's perfume. Eduardo slowly walked through the apartment, peering into every corner. In his childhood bedroom, occupied by Isabella in recent years, he noticed a small porcelain ballerina figurine on the windowsill. He had given it to her for her 10th birthday. Forgotten by accident or left behind on purpose. He gently picked it up and slipped it into his pocket. As he left, Eduardo glanced back at the empty apartment one last time. A part of his life had remained here, his childhood, his youth, his first steps into adulthood. But he felt no regret. Only certainty that he was doing the right thing. It's time to move on, he said quietly, locking the door. Autumn gave way to winter, and, contrary to what many might have expected, Eduardo felt no regret over his decisions, nor any desire to mend the broken ties. The apartment in the city center, once the family nest, sold for slightly more than the realtor had estimated. The deal went smoothly and quickly. A young family with 2 children was delighted by the spacious rooms and convenient location. On the day of signing the documents, Eduardo felt a strange lightness, as if he had severed the final thread connecting him to a painful past. The money was deposited into his account, and a new world of possibilities opened before him. After some thought, Eduardo decided not to rush into buying new property in the city. Instead, he began searching for a house in the countryside, spacious, with land, away from the urban chaos but with good transport access. A place where he could create a personal space that reflected his own sense of comfort. "Interesting choice," Diego commented when they met for lunch a month after the sale. "So you've finally decided to become a proper bearded hermit." Eduardo chuckled, stroking his now fuller ginger beard. "More like someone who finally decided to live for himself, not for others' expectations." "How's work? Any issues with remote days?" "I've already discussed it with my boss. I can work from home 3 days a week, 2 in the office. Actually, I'm even thinking of going fully remote and launching my own cybersecurity business." "Ambitious," Diego nodded with genuine respect. "You've changed a lot these past few months." It was true. Eduardo had changed, both outwardly and inwardly. He started going to the gym regularly, upgraded his wardrobe to something more stylish yet still comfortable, and became more confident in social interactions. The ginger beard that had once drawn constant mockery from his family now drew approving looks. Well-groomed and neatly trimmed, it had become part of his identity. "Heard anything from your mom?" Diego asked cautiously. "Isabella called last week," Eduardo replied, stirring his coffee. "Says they've moved in with Rafael's mother in the suburbs. Small 2-bedroom flat in an old building. It's a 2-hour commute to his job. Naturally, he's furious, but they didn't have a choice." "And your mother?" "According to Isabella, she's still offended and thinks I betrayed the family. But honestly, it doesn't bother me anymore." On the way home, Eduardo reflected on that conversation. Was it really true that his mother's opinion no longer affected him? The honest answer was, almost. Deep down, a small splinter still remained. Because like it or not, they were his family, his roots. But each day, that splinter irritated him less and less. That evening, Eduardo received a message from the realtor helping him search for a house. "Eduardo, I've found something interesting. A spacious house, land, near a forest. Only 30 minutes from the city. The owner is in a hurry to sell. The price is below market. Can you view it tomorrow?" "Yes, absolutely," Eduardo replied, feeling a spark of excitement light up inside him. The next day, he saw, for the first time, the house that would soon become his home. A 2-story timber house with a large veranda and panoramic windows overlooking a forest. The yard, though not perfectly maintained, had huge potential, a few fruit trees, space for a barbecue, even a small pond in the far corner. "The owner has to relocate abroad urgently, that's why the price is reduced," the realtor explained as she showed Eduardo the rooms. "On the market, this place would go for at least $2 million more." Eduardo walked through the house slowly, taking in every corner. A spacious living room with a fireplace, an open kitchen dining area, a study and guest bedroom on the first floor. Upstairs, a master bedroom with an ensuite, and 2 smaller bedrooms. In the basement, there was a sauna and utility room. Exactly as he had dreamed. "I'll take it," Eduardo said, standing on the veranda, gazing at the forest blanketed in early snow. "When can we start the paperwork?" The deal closed in record time. Within 2 weeks, Eduardo had the keys to his new home. He spent the entire winter settling in, finishing small repairs, ordering missing furniture, setting up a home office. By the end of February, the house had transformed into a perfect reflection of his style and preferences, functional, cozy, and thoughtfully designed. At the beginning of May, as the yard began waking up from winter, Eduardo decided to turn part of the land into a vegetable garden, small but practical. He had never done any gardening before, but the idea of growing his own vegetables appealed to him. He started with the basics: zucchini, pumpkins, tomatoes, and greens. One morning, while digging up the soil for planting, Eduardo heard the sound of a car approaching. That was unusual. His home sat apart from the main cottage communities, on a quiet dead-end street with only 3 houses, and the neighbors showed up mostly on weekends. Straightening up and brushing the dirt from his hands, Eduardo saw an unfamiliar car pulling up at his gate. A moment later, a woman in her mid-30s stepped out, wearing a simple linen blouse and jeans. In her hands, she held a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Good afternoon," she called out when she noticed Eduardo. "Are you the new owner?" "I am," he replied, walking toward the gate, wiping his hands on his jeans as he went. "I'm Catalina," she said with a smile, extending her free hand for a handshake. "I live in the last house on the street. Thought I'd stop by to say hello and bring you some of my baked goods." "Nice to meet you, I'm Eduardo. Please, come in. I can offer you coffee or tea on the veranda." Catalina turned out to be an artist who had moved to the countryside 3 years ago in search of inspiration and peace. She lived alone, aside from 2 cats and a dog, and earned her living by selling paintings online and running art workshops. "I mostly paint landscapes," she said as they sat on Eduardo's veranda with cups of tea. "The nature here is an endless source of inspiration. Every season, every time of day transforms the forest completely." "I've noticed," Eduardo nodded. "I work from home, my office window faces the forest. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the trees for hours instead of the screen." Their conversation flowed easily, shifting from topic to topic: rural life, favorite books, movies. Eduardo hadn't met someone in a long time with whom it was so easy to talk. Catalina didn't seem at all bothered by his appearance, his large build and red beard. On the contrary, at one point, she remarked, "You have an amazing, textured look. I'd love to paint your portrait one day, if you'll let me." "A portrait?" Eduardo blinked in surprise. "No one's ever painted me before." "Then it'll be the first time," Catalina smiled. "Think about it." As she was leaving, she invited Eduardo to a barbecue the following weekend, to meet other neighbors and just relax. He agreed, feeling a strange excitement, something youthful and long forgotten. Life was slowly but surely taking on new colors. Eduardo spent more and more time outdoors, working on his property or simply walking in the area. During work hours, he buried himself in code, tackling complex corporate cybersecurity challenges. In the evenings, he read, watched films, or chatted with his new neighbors, surprisingly open and friendly people. In June, he accepted Catalina's offer to sit for a portrait. She would come on weekends, set up her easel on the veranda, and paint for hours while Eduardo read or simply watched the forest. "I still can't get used to the silence," he admitted one day. "In the city, there's always background noise, cars, neighbors, appliances. Here it's just the wind, birds, and sometimes a distant tractor." "I had a hard time adjusting too," Catalina said, not looking up from her canvas. "The first few months, I even played recordings of city sounds to fall asleep. But eventually I realized, silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of the ones that actually matter." Eduardo looked at her, focused, a strand of hair falling across her face, that special light in her eyes people have when doing what they love. Something stirred inside him, something tender and long buried. Summer flew by. Eduardo settled completely into his new home, made friends with his neighbors, and even harvested his first modest crop from the garden. Professionally, changes were on the horizon as well. His company offered him the chance to lead a new cybersecurity division, with full remote work. Autumn greeted him with golden and crimson forests, crisp morning fogs, and an air so piercingly clear it felt like a fresh start. One of those days, Eduardo was working on the veranda wrapped in a warm blanket when his phone suddenly rang, from an unknown number. "Hello," he answered, still focused on his laptop screen. "Eduardo?" The voice sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "This is Rafael." Eduardo froze in surprise. His stepfather had never called him directly, always choosing to speak through his mother. "What can I do for you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I need to talk to you." Rafael's voice sounded different than Eduardo remembered, tired, without its usual arrogance. "In person." It's important. What about? Not over the phone, Eduardo. We can meet somewhere, or I can come to you if you give me the address. Eduardo hesitated. Curiosity wrestled with caution. Why did his stepfather suddenly want a meeting? What was so important he couldn't just say it? All right, he finally said. We can meet tomorrow at Cafe Central, 3 p.m. You know where that is? I'll find it. There was a note of relief in Raphael's voice. Thank you. The next day, as Eduardo approached the cafe in the city center, he felt an odd tension. He hadn't seen his family in nearly a year, since they moved out of his apartment. So much had changed in his life since then that the old pain and resentment had almost faded, leaving only a faint sadness that his own family couldn't accept him unconditionally. Raphael was already seated at a table in the corner of the cafe. Eduardo didn't recognize him at first. His stepfather had aged noticeably in just a year. His thinning hair had gone almost completely gray, his face had grown gaunt, and his eyes were dull. The usual stiff posture was gone, as if all the air had been let out of him. Hello, Eduardo, Raphael said, rising and offering a hand. Hello. Eduardo shook it and sat across from him. I'm listening. Raphael paused, drumming his fingers nervously on the table. I was never a good stepfather, he finally began. And I won't pretend to regret everything now. But, he looked up at Eduardo, I came to ask for your help. Not for me, for your mother. What happened? Eduardo tensed. She has a tumor in her breast. It might be malignant. She needs surgery and further treatment. Eduardo felt a cold wave spread through him. When did you find out? 2 weeks ago. They did a biopsy, we're waiting for the results, but the doctors aren't optimistic. Why didn't she call me? Eduardo asked, already knowing the answer. Of course she didn't call, because of pride, because of resentment, because of everything that had passed between them. You know your mother, Raphael said with a tired smile. She'd rather die than admit she needs help, especially yours. She still thinks you betrayed the family. And you? Raphael shrugged. What I think doesn't matter. The fact is, we're in a difficult situation. My salary barely covers the basics, and now there's the treatment. He spread his hands. I'm not asking for millions. Just help with the initial medical costs. For her, not for me. Eduardo thought. Despite everything that had happened, this was his mother, the woman who gave him life, who raised him, even if not always kindly. All right, he finally said. I'll pay for the treatment. But on one condition, I want to speak directly with her and with the attending physician. Raphael nodded with clear relief. Of course. She's at home now. We can go there right away, if you don't mind. During the drive, Eduardo stared out the car window at the city speeding by, thinking about how strangely fate worked. A year ago, he'd been ready to cut his family out of his life for good. Now, fate was bringing him back to them, but in a different role. Not as a son begging for acceptance, but as a man who no longer needed it. A man who could help on his own terms. Raphael's mother's apartment was exactly what Eduardo had imagined, a small 2-room flat in an old building, with low ceilings, a cramped kitchen, and modest furniture. Raphael's elderly mother, a kind-eyed woman, was absent, clearly having stepped out to give them privacy. Eduardo's mother sat in the living room, in front of a muted television. She looked noticeably thinner, her features sharpened, and her eyes filled with anxiety. When she saw her son enter, she flinched and straightened up, as if bracing herself. Why are you here? She asked, not looking at Raphael. Why did you bring him? Hello, Mom, Eduardo said quietly, sitting in the chair across from her. Raphael told me about your diagnosis. So what? Her voice was challenging. Came to watch me die? Gloat over your revenge? Mom, Eduardo shook his head. I never wished you harm. You threw us out of the house. Her voice trembled with indignation. made us live in this box, where Raphael spends 2 hours commuting every day. I didn't throw you out, Eduardo replied calmly. I just stopped supporting adults who didn't respect me or my feelings. There's a difference. What difference? She threw up her hands. You betrayed your family. And yet I'm here, Eduardo said softly. Willing to help with your treatment. She fell silent, as if this turn of events had caught her off guard. I don't need your help, she finally said, but without her former fire. I'll manage on my own. How? Eduardo asked plainly. With your pension? Or Raphael's salary? She turned away, avoiding his gaze. Health is more important than pride, Mom, Eduardo continued. I'm paying for the treatment not so you'll thank me, but simply because you're my mother. I want you to live. Silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock. Finally, his mother turned to him, and Eduardo saw tears in her eyes. You've changed, she said quietly. You've become someone else. Yes, Eduardo agreed. I've finally become myself. And you know what? It turned out to be the best decision of my life. On the way back, late in the evening, Eduardo reflected on the strange twists of fate. It turns out a person has to go through pain and separation to truly find their path. He had to lose his family in order to find himself. As he pulled up to his house, he noticed lights in the neighboring windows. Catalina was still awake. Her silhouette moved behind the curtains, likely working late on a painting. The portrait of Eduardo, in fact, was already finished, striking in its accuracy, capturing not just his appearance, but seemingly his very soul. In it, Eduardo was portrayed against the backdrop of the forest, with a faint half-smile and a calm, confident gaze. The way he had become in his new home, the way he was always meant to be. Dad would be proud of me, Eduardo thought as he stepped out of the car and breathed in the crisp night air. The apartment in the city center, left to him as an inheritance, had served its purpose, not as a place to live, but as a lesson. Sometimes, you have to lose something valuable to discover something priceless. And the greatest inheritance, Eduardo reflected, gazing up at the starry sky, is not property or money, it's the ability to stay true to yourself, no matter what. With that thought, he headed toward the glowing windows of his home, where a cup of tea and an unfinished book waited for him on the veranda, protected from the night's chill. Life went on his own terms.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.